Okay, good evening, everyone. Today we're going to begin learning nightly the Sefer Mesilas Yesharim. I don't know if you're able to get a hold of the book. What I'm going to do after every class is I'll just cut and paste out how much we covered and we'll send it along. I did send a link for you to be able to get an online copy that you could follow it along with me. For the first few minutes, I just want to give you a little introduction. Tonight, I'll give you a little introduction to the whole idea of what type of sefer this is. And tomorrow, we'll give you a little bit of an introduction on who the author was as well. But let me give you the overall context before we get into this sefer at all. And this book, Mesilas Yesharim, was written in the year 1740 by Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, who's better known by his acronym, Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. That's called Ramchal, Resh Mem Ches Lamed. It's very interesting that in this 18th century, there was a significant ideological phenomena in the Torah world that took hold. As in one decade, there were two major ethical teachers and works that came into being. The one we're going to study now, the Mesilas Yesharim, which was written by Luzzatto in 1740. And in 1734, the Baal Shem Tov began teaching Hasidus. So you see, within 6 years of each other, these are two titans in the spiritual world, living in different parts of the world. However, they were coming with great new teachings in Judaism, as it were. And then a century later, we'll see Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who launches the Musar movement. Now, what all three of them have in common is they emphasize the need for refining one's character traits and striving for greater spirituality. Now, there had been a lot of works written much earlier, hundreds of years before that, the Chovas HaVavos that we quoted last night, Rabbeinu Bechaya in the 1000s. Rabbeinu Yonah wrote the Sharei Tshuva in the 1200s. But the study of character refinement per se was not incorporated into the yeshivas, into the schools of learning until much, much later. And apparently many people thought that they could learn these techniques of spiritual growth on their own by learning Talmud, and it would just come by osmosis, so to speak. And so for whatever reason, this need for a more formal study was recognized essentially independently by all these three Torah leaders. And this was a new idea, that there'd be a formal structure, that you would sit down with a book and really study it to know it well. And this did not, obviously, this came with a lot of suspicion and opposition. Anything new to Judaism, people are wary about it. We know that the Hasidic movement was firmly opposed by the Torah establishment when it first came into the world. The Musar movement of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter was very much, the yeshivas were opposed to it when it first came into being. But as time has shown, that these things have been vindicated. And so too the works of the Ramchal, that really, in terms of written works that came before Hasidus and the Musar movement, in his Sefer that we'll be studying, Mesilas Yesharim, which in English translates as The Path of the Just, which is the most popular of all his works, it became a primer for the Musar that would come over 100 years later. Now, it's interesting to get an idea of how great this work is. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who was a great genius in Torah, he said the following. He said, volumes like those written by the great scholar Rabbi Yecheskel Landau, the Noda B'Yehuda, was all very, very deep Talmud discussions. He said, volumes like that I can write without any limit, but I could not compose even a single page of the Mesilas Yesharim. That's what Rabbi Yisrael Salanter said. And if you understand the humility that Rabbi Yisrael Salanter had, and the tremendous genius of Rabbi Yecheskel Lando, you can appreciate what he's saying about the Mesilas Yesharim. Now, there are many statements in the Talmud that emphasize the primacy of character development. The Midrash says, for example, in Vayikra Rabbah, it says that the Torah and mitzvahs were given for no other reason than to refine people's character. And Hashem, who obviously understood the human being better than anyone else and understands our essence and psychological composition, he provided, as we all know, the manufacturer's instruction booklet for the proper functioning of the product that he created, which is the human being. This is the manual for life. And it's interesting, the Baal Shem Tov had a wonderful insight in the creation of the world, when everything that was created by Hashem was only by Hashem. However, when Hashem expressed his desire to create the human being, he uses two words, na'aseh Adam, let us make man. So there's a whole discussion what the word us means. The Medrash talks about it, but the Baal Shem Tov says, who is the us in the creation of man? So he says the us is God and man. Let us make man. Then only together can a being called man come into existence. So let's think about this for a minute. So Luzzatto tells us that with one exception, all living beings were created in a state of completion. And all they do is grow, and all they do is change in size. And that's, a horse is born a horse, a little horse. And then what happens? He becomes a big horse. But a horse, he's a horse. And that's it. There's nothing more to happen to it, just for it to grow in size. And there's an angel on the other end, is a totally spiritual being, doesn't go through any change at all, doesn't grow. It's already everything that it is. But the human being is the only creature who is incomplete at his creation. Now, obviously, he's going to grow bigger, but the real part that's incomplete is a fully developed character and personality, which is not inherent at birth. He may have certain traits which are genetic, but the human being has the ability to modify his character traits and even to radically transform them if so needed. And therefore, the definition of man is that he's a being that is created incomplete and must work towards his own perfection. And since that's the being that God wanted, it's obviously that man could not have been created complete with a fully developed character and personality, because a being that's complete, we said, is either an angel or an animal, but not a man. So God said, na'aseh Adam, let us make man, which means you and I together. And Hashem is saying, I will give you all the potential, and you're to develop it to its highest degree. So therefore, man reaches his ultimate goal by maximizing his potential for spirituality. And this is done by utilizing the manual and fulfilling the prescribed formula, which is observance of Torah mitzvahs. However, it's still not that simple. The prerequisite for Torah and mitzvahs is what we call derech eretz. Derech eretz kodma laTorah. Derech eretz means decent behavior, which God expected of man, even in the absence of Torah teachings. The Talmud tells us that had the Torah not been given, man would have been expected to learn proper behavior from observation of nature. For example, he would have learned respect for private property from ants, modesty from cats, fidelity from pigeons. So man had the capability of understanding these things. Although one could ask, isn't it possible that without the Torah, maybe man could learn not such wonderful things from, for example, he could learn promiscuity from dogs, and he could learn vanity from peacocks. So maybe you could learn some not such good things. But King Solomon said that Hashem made man asa Elokim es ha'adam yashor. Hashem made man yashor, straight, which means that Hashem expects the human being to exercise his innate sense of judgment and emulate desirable characteristics. So man is capable of making the right decisions in how to develop his personality. And therefore God made man straight, Yashor. That's the name of this book. It's called Mesilas Yesharim, the path of those whose nature is to become straight people. That's what the book's about. It helps us develop this quality. Now, this concept of derech eretz being the prerequisite for Torah, one of the great Hasidic masters, Reb Mendel of Rimenov, points out a very interesting thing. The Talmud said that when the Jews were in the desert, God gave them manna. They were given manna, and the Torah says it was a test to see whether they would observe the Torah or not. And Reb Mendel asks, what's the relationship of the manna to the Torah? And he says like this. He says, the basic concept of decent human behavior and respect for the rights of others and the avoidance of greed and envy is based on a bitachon, on a trust that Hashem provides a person with everything that they need. Greed and envy and theft are the result of a person incorrectly justifying that he can gain by such feelings and behavior. But if a person recognizes that everything he's supposed to receive is coming from Hashem, he has no reason to covet what other people have or want what other people have. So therefore, decent behavior requires a sincere trust in Hashem. And that's what the Jews learned from the manna. Each Jew got what he was supposed to have, no matter how much he gathered. So they got the message was very clear. Each day, God gives you exactly what you need, no more and no less. When the Jews understood that God was going to take care of all their needs, that would free them from all these undesirable character traits, which are the precondition for receiving the Torah. As the Gemara says, the Torah is only given to those who eat manna. So what does that mean? We don't eat manna today, but the idea is it's the principle. You don't have to exactly eat the manna, but if you have the principle of the manna, knowing that Hashem gives you everything that you need, and you have that emunah, then you can develop proper character traits. And then you're capable of studying Torah. And therefore, the goal of this sefer, like other Sfarim, but this was really the first one that really focused so much on this, is to point out the path whereby a person can attain the status of being a yashor, a straight person. Being a yashor is the natural state of man that he is supposed to develop into. Whereas angels and animals are created in their natural, completed state, man has to follow a path that's going to bring him to the desired state of spiritual perfection. This is what is called the Mesilas Yesharim, the path of the just. So that's a little introduction to the nature of the work. Tomorrow we're going to talk a little bit about the author, but I want to start the book right in the beginning, the Hakdamas HaRamchal, the introduction of the Ramchal to this work. Now my goal is, and the reason I'm learning this, is that there's a number of chapters, and I don't intend on learning the whole book, but there are two very critical characteristics in terms of a person. It's called Zehirus, watchfulness, and inspecting one's behavior, and Srizus and alacrity, which are the two cornerstones to character development. And during this time that we're in our homes much more than we usually are, and it's a time for a lot of self-introspection, so this sefer really is ideal. But before we can get to those two chapters, we have to do the introduction and the first chapter, which sets the basis for everything. So let's start with the opening words, and just for the sake of time, I'm just going to read with the translation in English to save us the time from the Hebrew. You're welcome to look at the Hebrew on your own. And let's just look at the first paragraph and see some very great ideas here. So the author writes like this. He says, I did not write this book in order to teach people something new of which they had been unaware, but rather to remind them of that which they already knew very well. You know, that's very unusual. Mostly people write books for something they have new to teach people. Why do people write books? Well, many do it to make money. Certainly Luzzatto did not have that in mind. But usually you have this novel concept you want to share with people. So he's saying that's not the reason I'm writing the book. He says, in most of my words, you will not find anything other than observations about which most people have little doubt. It's not even really to persuade anybody, he's saying. However, it is precisely those concepts which are most evident that tend to be overlooked. And ironically, it is common for people to be oblivious to those ideas whose truth is unchallenged. Therefore, since this book contains little new information, there is no advantage in reading it only once, because the reader will not gain any new knowledge. The advantage of this book can result only from repeated readings, because that may remind people of those things that tend to be forgotten. And a person can then set his heart to those obligations which one tends to overlook. That's the opening paragraph. So let's analyze this. And there's a couple of very important ideas. And what Luzzatto is drawing our attention to is a very important psychological principle. Now, it's true that sometimes a person may behave improperly because of ignorance. He just doesn't know what's the proper way to behave. But more often than not, people do have the knowledge that should stop them from doing things that are wrong. Yet this knowledge doesn't appear to impact upon their behavior. How do we account for that? So this phenomena, which modern psychology has given a term to it. What's that term? It's denial. Now, it's interesting. How would we compare denial to lying? Same, different? Well, denial is not the same as lying, because lying is a conscious distortion of fact. In other words, the liar knows that he's lying, whereas denial is an unconscious process. It's a process in which a person is totally unaware that he is denying anything, and the person is certain that he's in possession of the truth. Okay, now this concept of denial, which certainly in more recent history, Freud has spoken about, but Luzzatto is talking about it right here, and he really draws it from the Navi Yeshaya, the prophet Isaiah. Let's just quote from Isaiah chapter 6, verse 10. He says, the heart of this people is fattened, his ears are dull, and his eyes are pasted. Why? Lest he understand with his heart, hear with his ears, and see with his eyes, then he would do tshuva and be healed. So what's the Navi saying? The Navi's telling us that a person may refuse to become aware of what's obvious, because such awareness would necessitate him making changes in his behavior. And since making changes in behavior is so uncomfortable, his psychological mechanism allows him to maintain the status quo by making him oblivious to some aspects of reality. Because after all, we're creatures of habit, and changing our ways has a lot of discomfort. So to avoid the distress involved in changing our ways, our clever unconscious mind prevents our mind of even being aware of the factors or the things that need to happen to change. We're wired for survival, and we're wired to stay away from things that are painful. And change is painful. So therefore, unconsciously, our minds prevent us from being aware of these things. And this is what Luzzato's honing in on in the very first few lines of the book. He says, I'm not going to tell you something you don't know. But what am I going to do? He says, but it's important to review. So we could ask a question now. If denial operates to make someone unaware of what he already knows, how is repetition going to help? And the answer is that denial can often be overcome by attrition. This is very similar to the phenomena of Rabbi Akiva. What did Rabbi Akiva see that motivated him to do tshuva? We know the famous story that he saw the rock with water dripping down, drop after drop after drop, and made a hole into the rock. And he said, if water, which is so soft, can make a hole into the rock, the Torah, which is so powerful, can't it penetrate into my heart? But what did he see? It was one drop after another, after another, after another. And therefore, resistance to awareness can eventually be worn away through repetition. If you don't want to know about something, you don't want to know about something, but you keep hearing it, and you keep hearing it, and it keeps hitting at you over and over and over and over, something's going to get through. That's what Luzzato's saying. He understands as human beings, we are wired for denial. We don't want to know about being a better person. Not that we're bad, God forbid. Not that we're liars, God forbid. But we're wired to survive. And therefore, we don't want to be in uncomfortable situations. And if a person has a character flaw, and as we know, the great rabbis say that it's harder to change one character flaw than to go through the entire Talmud. And I'm telling you, to go through the entire Talmud is very hard. Harder to change a character flaw. So this is what Luzzato's saying. I don't have anything new to tell you. These things are so obvious, no one's going to argue about it. But the problem is you don't want to think about it. You don't want to be reminded about it. Because those things are going to be hurtful. But to really get, you're going to gain, you're not going to hear anything new. But if you keep repeating these ideas, something's going to get in. Now, how can we escape this pitfall of denial? By thinking the following mantra. And this is a good mantra for us to go by. We should say like this: as a fallible human being, I must have some defects that need correction. And there's nothing wrong about admitting that, because we all are given them. And you have to be constantly alert to their detection. Always on the alert. Where are my defects? It's interesting, the great tzaddik Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev was once standing at his doorway when a cobbler passed by looking for work. And he said to Reb Levi Yitzchak, he's trying to get some business, you know. So what did the cobbler innocently say to Reb Levi Yitzchak? He says, you must have something that needs fixing, don't you? So Reb Levi Yitzchak tearfully turns to his wife and said, see, even he can tell I have to do improvement in my midos. That wasn't what the cobbler had in mind. But Reb Levi Yitzchak was always alert to try to see if there's any flaws. So if he hears such a statement, he's not thinking about shoes, he's thinking about his neshama. And let's focus on one last point in this paragraph. The last clause says people need to be reminded of the things they tend to forget. And then he says, and a person can then set his heart to those obligations which one tends to overlook. He says a person then can set his heart to those obligations. Now, in chapter 1, that we'll be learning in a few days, Luzzatto elaborates exactly what a person's duty in the world, his obligation is. But here in the opening paragraph, simply the concept that there's a duty, that there is something called a duty that a person has, should be enough to make a person give serious consideration to his behavior. You see, all living things, including humans, tend to seek pleasure and avoid distress. There are times, however, when a person will accept a measure of discomfort in order to achieve a particular goal. That we know. A student, for example, may deprive himself of sleep or other various enjoyable activities and spend many hours in study because you want to have a proficiency in a particular field, because then you'll get a good grade or whatever, then one day you'll get a good job, whatever. So you're willing to give up immediate gratification for something that's going to be more gratifying later on. Similarly, a businessman or a professional person will put a lot of effort and time into a specific task because he's looking for a favorable outcome, although he could be enjoying his time of leisure with something else, but he gives it up because he's got to stay after work, he's got to get more done because there's going to be a big, big payoff at the end of the line. You see, when a person has a goal, sacrifice of pleasure is feasible. And not just feasible, but maybe even desirable if you have a goal. However, a person has no goal other than the pursuit of pleasure. If that is your only goal, then sacrifice is not likely to happen. You know why? Because it doesn't make any sense to sacrifice pleasure for the sake of having pleasure. If the goal is pleasure, then why are you going to sacrifice pleasure for pleasure? That doesn't make any sense. You got to find something beyond that, something more than what the pleasure can give you. So therefore, when we're talking about refining one's character and achieving spirituality, that requires a lot of sacrifice and tolerance of the discomfort of instituting some changes in your life. This cannot and will not happen if a person has no goal other than pleasure seeking, right? And therefore, the entire sefer hinges on this single phrase, to set his heart to his obligations. It's only when a person has a sense of obligation to achieve a goal will one consider character refinement. Most people in the world today do not consider the fact that they have obligations in this world. No different than the title of the work of Chovos Halvavos, duties of the heart. People don't think I got duties. I don't got obligations. I don't have responsibilities. People only say I have rights. I'm entitled to this. I'm entitled to that. And if that's all you're looking for, and we're living in a society that is wired for only one thing, just pleasure. And that's my goal, and that's everything in life. And everything's going to be decided by what's going to give me pleasure. Then they're not interested in any obligations. Most people in the world right now have only one thing in mind. I'm not enjoying myself. I'm not having any pleasure. Very few people are looking about their obligations. This work is all about obligations. Now, usually we're way too busy to worry about our obligations. We're way too busy to worry about character refinement. Last night I discussed that statement of 2% of people think, 3% of people think they're thinking, and 95% of people would rather die than think. The answer is, Luzzato's telling us what? 95% of people would rather die than think, because if they think, that means they're going to have some obligations. And they don't want to sacrifice pleasure because of obligations. They'd rather die than think. Some people think they're thinking, but aren't really making many sacrifices or obligations. But you that are listening tonight, you're the 2% that you're looking to find out what those obligations are. And when this virus passes, if we come to a better understanding of what those obligations are and how we can repair them, then we've gained an awful lot. So that's the beginning of the introduction. I'm going to try to make it a half an hour every night. God willing, stay tuned. We'll send a copy of the text to review this a little bit. Remember, the idea is review, review, review. And then we'll see as we pass on in the weeks, we'll develop a structure in which we can really zero in and find certain areas in our life that we can really improve, and we can fulfill the words of the Torah of Nasa Adam, let us make man. Let us, in this time, make ourselves into even better people than we already are, which will make us worthy for Mashiach when it will come. Amen. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.
And we'll see you later tomorrow. Same time, same station. All right. Take care.
Thank you.